What is going on, everyone? It's your guy, Cole Jackson, back with another episode of the Two Guys Watching Football Training Camp preview series for your Baltimore Ravens. If you're enjoying this series, do me a favor, click that like button and click subscribe so you can find your way back for more episodes. Today, we are joined by a good friend of mine, Spencer Schultz of Baltimore Beatdown, including the Baltimore Beatdown podcast and Sports Info Solutions. Spencer, my guy, how is it going?
It's going quite well. I'm pumped to see you start this entity, and it's been fun. I've watched a couple interviews. You had a great one with Jeff, and James had some good insight, and it's been a lot of fun. I'm happy to see you looking happy, having some fun, and back out into the Ravens and football world, getting some thoughts out, having some takes, all that fun stuff right ahead of training camp. It's good stuff.
I appreciate it. I appreciate the alliance. Me and Spencer were just talking offline. Jake Lukes helped me so much with some of the nitty gritty behind the scenes. So appreciate the alliance with the Baltimore Beatdown podcast, guys. It's meant a lot to me. And today we're going to be jumping into what I think is probably going to be the most highly anticipated group of the Baltimore Ravens, and that is the wide receiver group. Before we jump into it, let's take a second. There's been a lot of changes. Let's recap who's coming to training camp fighting for roster spots. So returning for the Ravens, we have Marquise Brown, Miles Boykin, and 2020 draft picks Devin Duvernay and James Prochet. In addition, Jalen Moore is not getting any buzz, but I did want to take a second to note him because Jay-Z did mention when he was with us last week. You guys can go back and watch that. I'll link it down in the description below. That he's really standing out at practice squad or at OTAs this year. So it's going to be a tough fight for that last spot, but that's big praise that he's kind of getting noticed. And then the story of the offseason, of course, was the wide receiver additions. EDC tells us he's happy with the group. EDC turns around. He adds three, pretty big name wide receivers. So we have Sammy Watkins joining as a free agent. We have 2021 draft picks Rashad Bateman and Tylan Wallace. And we also have Deon Cain, Benjamin Victor, and Devin Gray in camp as well, fighting for spots in practice squad spots. So with all that covered, we got a lot to talk about. Spencer, are you ready, my man?
I am absolutely ready. I'm excited. And as you said, definitely the most anticipated group on this roster.
Definitely. And, amongst all this anticipation, something that I think has almost gone overshadowed is year 3 of Marquise Brown. Jay-Z mentioned last week he's a Hollywood Brown apologist. And, you and I have talked quite a bit. I'm a bit of a Hollywood Brown apologist. I think the timing with the tweet, the feeding your soldiers and then the drops, I think the timing was worse than if the tweet hadn't come out and he had a couple of those drops, because in the grand scheme of things, compared to his targets, there weren't that many drops last year. It was kind of the timing that just didn't really add up. So, let's take a look at Marquise Brown before we get into the rest. So, Spencer, what can you tell us about Brown's 2020 season, and what do you expect from him in 2021?
Well, Cole, you and I were on the same page very much so that Hollywood, what he seems to do and where Lamar struggled last year, and you and Gordon talked about it, was something we had expressed so many times, was Lamar just getting the ball out late, not trusting himself. Sometimes that was a result of inefficient footwork or just hesitancy and not trusting his protection or whatever it was. And of course, Hollywood Brown is not, the biggest guy. He can go up and get the ball if he needs to, but not really as much in those contested 50-50 type ball situations. Like, people say he has a small catch radius. In contested situations, I'll say yes. But ultimately, Lamar didn't just let it rip as soon as he thought Hollywood has a chance, because where Hollywood seems to break defenses a lot of the time, when you're talking specifically in the deep game as well, is in the transition phase of the secondary and their coverage, where guys are flat-footed and trying to transition into their back pedal or into, their half responsibility or something. Hollywood accelerates between, I want to say, this is just me guessing, but between 8 and 15 miles an hour in 2 steps. He's so light. He's a track star. He trains on tracks all off season. Great speed. And Lamar just didn't let the ball go soon enough. It ended up in a lot of situations where defensive backs had time to recover, able to chase the ball down. Then it's, your 5'9", 170-pound receiver working back to the ball when a 6 foot, 200-pound safety is kind of playing center field and able to actually track and have some momentum into the catch point. So those situations were difficult. And yeah, Marquise Brown does drop some balls. He did. But when you go look at, especially in today's game, when you go look at the top receivers, aside from like DeAndre Hopkins, guys drop balls. DK Metcalf drops a ton of balls. AJ Brown drops a ton of balls. So, I mean, yeah, he does drop balls. And sometimes the football, this is also silly, but sometimes the football just looks a little big for him. Like, I don't know how to explain it. I don't think he has bad hands or anything, but he kind of just doesn't have strong hands necessarily all the time. And I think he can clean that up a little bit. But the thing that he does so well is it goes back to the Oklahoma coaching points. And I've watched a couple clinics of Lincoln Riley, and what he was talking specifically about CeeDee Lamb and Marquise Brown in this case. And he likes his receivers. And when I say likes his receivers, he forces his receivers to run full speed routes. They don't like a lot of rhythm break. They don't like a lot of deceleration. They want, if you're running a corner, you're running through that transition as quickly and efficiently as you can, not trying to set up and stack as much. So I think it's been a little bit of a difficult match with Lamar at times, but the developments at the end of the season with what Marquise Brown was doing after the catch was maybe the most encouraging thing I saw all year. And especially in that Titans win in the wild card, you see him in orbit motion. You see him getting those manufactured touches, able to make guys miss. Even in week 17, he laid a stiff arm down on a quick little, I think it might have just been a little alert, and put a stiff arm into a guy and goes and gets a first down. So he was looking really confident. And at the end of the day, he is, Hollywood primetime Jet in the playoff games that he plays. You need a catch, you need a big gain. He has been there to provide it. So I definitely think I am about as high as you can be on Marquise Brown. I know that you're up there. I know you said Jeff is up there as well. I think he is a rock star in many ways. He is what he is, and he's not what he's not. He's not going to be that contested catch guy, but I hate to say it, but if you put him on Seattle with Russell Wilson, who loves to anticipate and throw those early moon balls on those 9 routes, I think he would be, having a little bit more substantial success in that area. But he's had a ton of intermediate success over the middle of the field with Lamar. Lamar is able to find him on digs all the time. They run a lot of dagger concepts. And, you think of 3rd and 18 against the Bills backed up in their own territory. Boom, dagger concept over the middle of the field. Marquise Brown goes, fights, gets the catch, picks up a first down. So I'm excited. I'm excited for these new coaches to come in and for him to have a little bit more of a veteran feel and be maybe fully healthy.
Yeah, and the other thing that I don't want to discount, and I'll credit Jay-Z because he did make this point, and it's something I didn't really think about, but he had the screw in the foot in his rookie season, and then the screw comes out. He's obviously going to be a little bit faster. How faster? Maybe not a crazy amount, but everything, little things like that are going to alter your chemistry, how you read the guy, how you read their break, that sort of thing. Go into the next off season where it's COVID stricken. There's restrictions everywhere. Guys are in and out of practices, out of games. I have no doubt that kind of impacted just the sheer amount of reps that they were able to have. Like, everything was just shortened last offseason. So now it's kind of like things are looking a little bit normal. Training camp's going to be normal. We're going to get preseason games. I know he's probably not going to get a whole ton of snaps, but those little nitty gritty things are huge for chemistry when we're talking about a deep ball guy.
Absolutely. And speaking of the limited participation, Marquise Brown didn't participate in his rookie training camp. He didn't play in the preseason. He might have played the last game. I can't recall all the way, but I know that he did in the first 3. He was off doing, speed and recovery and pliability work for most of training camp, and he came in and got like 1 week of actual practice. Of course, he goes and lights the world on fire. I think the funniest part about his rookie debut game, I think he only played about 15 or 16 snaps and ended up with, 160 yards, 2 touchdowns, whatever it was. But so it's going to be huge. And talking about James Prochet, talking about Devin Duvernay and some of those other guys that didn't have a real training camp last year, that's one of the most exciting aspects of this group, is getting these guys the full work, going against another team, being able to do that live scrimmage against are they doing against can't recall who they're doing it against this year off the top of my head. I think it is the
Panthers.
The Panthers, that sounds right. So getting those live reps in against another team, all that good stuff is going to be paramount. And of course it will be for other teams as well. But when you're talking about this pass catching group, they're so young relative to other teams. So it might make a bigger difference.
Absolutely. And moving into the next guy I want to talk about, it's the primetime rookie himself. It's Rashad Bateman. You know, I know you dove into his film at Minnesota quite a bit. I know you said he watched it a few times. So, you know, what can you tell us what to expect from the rookie in year one? Specifically, I'd like to ask, you know, what can he do to add an element to the passing offense?
What he can do, and I'm going to lump Sammy Watkins in there as well, who we'll get to, is work over the middle of the field with a big body, with the ability to gain yards after the catch. And I think that is secretly maybe the biggest shortcoming that the Ravens have had the last couple of years is yak. They just haven't had it. Mark Andrews can be a pretty effective yak receiver. He gets combo coverage now. He gets a triangle around him. He gets boxed in. There are eyes on him. Jesse Bates put it very well. We're looking at it 15 and 89. You know, they're not going to be letting him rumble down the field. He's got to go make plays against, you know, schemes that are working towards him. And so I think Bateman, one of the most underrated aspects of his game, I believe it was actually PFF, he broke a tackle on 32% of his receptions at Minnesota. That means you give the kid 3 touches, he's making someone miss. That's crazy. That is unbelievable. He was a really high-level basketball player. He was a D1 level basketball player. He had tons of offers. And you see from that, you see safety awareness, which translates to both route running in terms of where the soft spot's going to be, which helps against zone coverage very much so, even a little bit more than man, as well as yak. Knowing where the angle is going to be, knowing where the hit is going to come from, being able to anticipate it, almost feel it, and go make a move. He was a driving, slashing kind of point guard that could shoot, and all of that translates really well. That also shows up in his hezzies, in his ability to stutter, in his ability to jab and accelerate. He can make guys miss without the ball. He can play off ball. That's, you know, another talent of basketball that comes into it. Being able to work without the ball, get open, make a play, drive to the lane, drive, you know, work the middle of the field, all that good stuff. So I think those are the underrated aspects. The things that I liked about Rashad Bateman the most, when I look at one area that I like about him the most, the Ravens don't run a ton of double moves. You know, it's not their forte necessarily, not the way that their passing offense is set up, but the man makes a slant and a sluggo. And Elijah Moore was the other player that did this really well, that was kind of outside that top 3 tier, the tier 1 guys that went really early in the first round. Him and Elijah Moore can make a slant look like a sluggo. They can make a post look like a post corner. It is the exact same footwork. There is no sort of giveaway. It is the exact same. And finally, I think that what he does so well is just his transitions at the top of routes. His breaks are so snappy and clean. I like to compare his feet to Calvin Ridley, his toes to Calvin Ridley. You'll see maybe, you know, an inch or less of his toe off the ground when he is starting to transition through his break. That eliminates drag, and he is so efficient in his breaks. He separates so cleanly. It almost looks like it's like a sped up video at sometimes, because he isn't running faster. I don't really know how he does it. I guess his just mechanics are so smooth that he has no wasted motion through his breaks. So I see him being able to be someone who works over the middle of the field, separates, and of course, he was, I believe, the 3rd highest graded player on the outside per PFF, and Sports Info Solutions had him among the receivers who have had at least 50 targets on the outside in the last 2 years. I think he had the 5th highest WAR, wins above replacement, of all receivers on the outside since 2019. So he's going to be able to work on the outside. He's going to be able to be that X-type guy who can beat press. Matt Harmon from Yahoo does the reception perception, which is one of my favorite things in all of the Twitter sphere and all of, you know, wide receiver conversations especially. And he's studying success rate against press, success rate against man coverage, success rate against zone coverage, and Bateman beats press. So, you know, if it gets to the point where teams maybe do start trying to press him, if he's successful, he's going to excel there as well. So the Ravens don't face a ton of press, because press usually comes with man, and man usually ends up with Lamar Jackson scrambling. So that is a dual-edged sword, and he just has a very balanced, nuanced game. And the player that I like to compare him to, some people say like Michael Thomas, some people say Keenan Allen, some people say a bevy of different receivers. The guy he reminds me of is Reggie Wayne. Just a very complete, balanced game without being, you know, a 4-3 guy or a 6-3 guy or a 5-10 burner kind of guy. He just wins underneath. He wins over the middle. He wins on the outside. He wins deep. All 3 phases of the game, all 3 levels he can win at. So someone that I was really high on, and it was almost, the first time in quite some time where it was like, all right, the Ravens got the guy that everybody wanted them to get. And it almost felt like I reached a point right before the draft where I was like, okay, they're not going to take him. He's not even going to get picked in the first round. Like it would just be too perfect. And boom, spot on. The Ravens take him and get their guy.
I legit tweeted I think 3 minutes before the pick came, and I was like, there's no way they're actually going to draft Rashad Bateman. It makes too much sense. It kind of reminded me of when 2018 came around and their first pick before the first trade back came up, and Ridley and Moore both sitting there. And I'm like, this makes too much sense. There's no way they do it. Of course, they trade back, one's gone, trade back again, the second one's gone. I'm like, this is such classic Ravens. That's kind of what the difference with Eric DeCosta has been. It's
not fighting yourself to be smart.
No, and he
just gets it.
And it's the Ozzie Newsome thing. And I hate criticizing Ozzie because he did so much good for so long for this team, but it's not a surprise. Wide receiver was his biggest gap in his career here. And it wasn't necessarily that he couldn't scout it, or I don't necessarily believe that. He did not prioritize it in the draft. It was not part of his team building philosophy. He very much believed in we can build a strong defense and we can supplement with veterans. We saw him do it over and over again. And, to be fair, it led to success. It led to so many winning seasons. It led to 2 Super Bowls. So it's hard to sit here and crap on the guy, but all I'm saying is it's been a very obvious transition when everyone said, well, EDC worked, he lived under Ozzie. He's just going to be Ozzie 2.0. Well, if you want a very distinct difference, it's investing in the draft at the wide receiver position and continuing to take shots and to throw darts at the board to find your guys. And it's crazy to think when you look at the group right now, we may actually have a wide receiver core.
And part of that is establishing a pipeline. You're talking about taking those swings and misses. You have to make contact eventually. Look at the Steelers. They have found a system. They don't need to go draft first-round receivers anymore because they got the right coaches in place. They have the right understanding of what they want out of their receivers. Of course, it helps when you have, a Hall of Fame caliber quarterback that is going to aid that process. But over the years, they're able to find Deontay Johnson and Chase Claypool and Martavius Bryant and Juju Smith, all these guys outside of the first round because they have the system in place. And, for years, that was the Ravens' defensive line. Or, the Ravens are lauded around the league for their tight ends. The Ravens always have a good tight end group. So it's finding those coaches. And that's why T. Martin, Keith Williams, 2 guys that have college experience with younger guys tackling this room, bringing in fresh perspective and a clean slate with these guys like Miles Boykin and James Prochet. Miles Boykin's had his struggles, but Keith Williams and T. Martin are going to hold him accountable for what he does moving forward, not have, David Culley's glasses on, who literally does wear glasses. So I'm not trying to poke fun at that, but for him to be able to come in, have a clean slate, maybe he takes off or maybe he, sinks underwater even more so, but to have a clean slate, fresh perspective, all that good stuff is going to help so much. And, Rashad Bateman working with Hollywood, working with Mark Andrews in the offseason already, they're all chummy, buddy out in Scottsdale, Arizona, work with Bateman's trainer. And maybe that helps Hollywood in some aspects, and Hollywood and Mark can get Bateman on the same page in terms of what Greg Roman's playbook is and all that good stuff. So overall, it just feels like fresh blood. And then, bringing in a veteran like Sammy Watkins that has the notebook on the NFL corners, a guy that succeeds for 6, 7, 8 years at a relatively high level. He's going to know how, especially coming from the AFC as well, he's going to know how Adoree Jackson that he's faced a couple of times, or know how Stephon Gilmore likes to operate and have a couple notes because he's a professional. And I mean, he is a pretty crazy guy. He's the Lizard King or whatever the hell he called himself. But I would assume he's got a notebook of some sort that looks good. So all that stuff is looking good for Bateman.
And this is the perfect segue because I think one of the missing elements last year was having some sort of veteran leader in the wide receiver room with the young guys that were in there last year. Now we got even more youth in Bateman and Wallace. And, Watkins can come in and he's going to have an easier transition because he's played with Roman. He's worked under Williams. I think it's Williams. Yeah, he worked with Williams in the offseason, so he's got a relationship there. And yes, they added Des Bryant last year, but he wasn't in there the whole year.
That showed the desperation that they were at one point because they rejected Des. Boykin struggles, and you're like, well, I guess we're gonna have to bring in Des.
Yeah. And this has a completely different feel. Like, I know I get the concerns with Sammy Watkins' health. Fair enough. I don't really see that big of a concern with Sammy Watkins' on-field abilities. So, like, let's take a look at that. Like, how do you see him fitting in and making an impact on this wide receiver group?
In a similar way to Rashad Bateman, especially with ISO reps, that was one of the big things that was a takeaway from last season. Basically, the only receiver that was going to get the ball when isolated, in other words, away from the formation and there's no receiver to his side, was Marquise Brown. And pretty much every time he was isolated, he was going to get a target. So that was a tell. Brown is a guy that's not going to be able to go win in those, heavy hitter, strong safety, looking over the middle kind of situations. I think that Bateman and Watkins both are going to be able to run some RPO slants and be able to bring a presence over the middle of the field. Watkins is a little mysterious to me in his deep ability, because not that it's a question mark for him, but his usage on the Chiefs, especially last year, was so heavily towards the middle of the field and in the intermediate 10 to 19 yard area that I'm curious to see how the Ravens are going to maybe deviate from that or roll into that, and how they'll defer between Bateman and Watkins, guys that it feels like are going to take the majority of those X or those, twin Z reps or things like that. So I'm curious to see what he can do down the field. He had a lot of success on limited targets in 2019, if I recall correctly. I think Mahomes had 158.3 when targeting him over 20 yards downfield. That was not the case last year, but I'm just curious to see, because it looks like, and we don't like to put too much stock into OTAs and all that stuff and what's going on, but it looked like Lamar was connecting with him deep quite a bit, and like the fact that he has a 6'2", 215-pound receiver that can win down the field. And not that, this is something Watkins is going to do week in and week out. I think consistency can be an issue for him, but in that 2019 Super Bowl, the one that the Chiefs beat the 49ers in, he toasted Richard Sherman with some really savvy releases. He was able to win down the field, go attack the ball. And finally, the thing that I was extremely impressed with, just from a statistical point of view, was Sports Info Solutions will chart broken plays, which means, the guy let's say, a team runs a sail concept or a flood concept, and then that concept expires, the quarterback breaks the pocket, turns into a broken play. Watkins, I think, caught 9 of 10 targets for 119 yards and a touchdown in those broken plays last year with the Chiefs. So, Mahomes, Josh Allen, Russell Wilson, Deshaun Watson, all these mobile, younger, gunslinging quarterbacks, Lamar Jackson, they're going to break the pocket. You're going to need to work with them, work yourself open, and go make plays. And that's something Watkins actually did in that Super Bowl as well. He kind of lost Richard Sherman, got in Richard Sherman's blind spot, sat down, and then worked back to Mahomes. Ends up getting a huge gain on third down and helping them win that game. I believe that was in the early fourth quarter, but late in that game. So working on broken plays, being big, being able to work the middle of the field, and go get some first downs. I don't see him. It's hard to put into words. You think of Willie Snead as someone who was a tough chain mover, but a guy that was pretty limited to the slot. So I think Watkins is a little similar in terms of like toughness and what they want from him to find soft spots, work with Lamar, and be that reliable veteran presence. But he's going to be doing it from the outside as well as the slot, and he's a little bigger and a little more athletic. But Snead was healthy, and Watkins has had, quoting himself, goes a little bit too hard in practice and misses some time. So he liked that the Ravens wanted to keep him on a practice pitch count. And for instance, Shohei Ohtani in baseball, he hasn't taken a batting practice the entire year, has 34 home runs. So sometimes with those guys, you got to just tone them down in practice.
Yeah. Gamers, man, they're gamers. And that's a big aspect. Like it's not really to knock Willie Snead. He is who he is, but Watkins is just a more dynamic player. He has a more dynamic skill set. And, with these three, with Brown, Bateman, and Watkins, they have a really unique ability to kind of move all three of these guys into all three of like your 11 personnel wide receiver slots. All three of them can work out of the slot. All three of them can work on the line. All three of them can work the Z. And I'm sure it's going to kind of work out where you're going to see Watkins and Bateman doing more of the X, but I think it creates more flexibility to create those matchups. And, like you said, when we were talking about Andrews, or when Andrews was mentioned, like it's harder to key in on 2 guys when you now have 4 guys to worry about. And I personally, from what I've seen, think Watkins is good enough to take advantage of his one-on-ones when, you know, the defense is focusing on other guys. Like it's now that you have to worry about legitimate receivers.
He worked Marcus Peters a few times last year in one-on-one situations
100%.
because you had to worry about Hill and you had to worry about Kelsey.
I honestly think his injury history has just kind of gotten this, he's a washed up player vibe going from people. And it's, you know, he's not the number 1 that he could have been when he was in Buffalo and he was putting up the 1,000-yard seasons. Like he looked like he was developing into that. And, you know, maybe he isn't going to be that, but as a veteran on this team that's focused on passing efficiency, I think he's exactly what, you know, the doctor ordered. And I think he's going to really capitalize on his opportunities.
Absolutely. And the fact that Keith Williams, who is the pass game specialist, is his personal trainer, and Sammy Watkins is going to know what to expect from Keith Williams, what he's going to want, and how to, you know, vocalize that in the meeting room, on the practice field, and get those younger younger receivers up to speed. Also, he's worked with Greg Roman in the past. You know, is it the same offense? No, but they run a lot of pistol and utilize a lot of play action. So there's definitely some basic elements that are still very similar. So Watkins is interesting. And yeah, like you said, allowing Marquise Brown to play in the slot a lot or a little bit, and Bateman to play, you know, all 3 of those guys can be interchangeable. And I think Marlon Humphrey just kind of summed it up very well. And, you know, sometimes you think is the teammate blowing smoke up his own team's, you know, rear end, you know, maybe not. But he said in the past, I've been practicing against 2-3 guys that are really testing me, really testing Marcus. Now it's 5, 6, 7 guys that are giving us some problems, and that helps your defense. That helps everything. It is your entire ecosystem when you have depth and when you have talent with depth. So I love the signing of Sammy Watkins, considering the pick of Rashad Bateman. As I said before, the Sammy Watkins was signed after they kind of struck out on Juju, which might have been a blessing in disguise. But if you only bring in Sammy Watkins, you have not solved your problem. If you bring in Sammy Watkins and, you know, spend a first on a receiver or bring in another veteran, that's a good signing. And that's exactly what they did. So it worked out well.
Absolutely. And then going to the other guy that they drafted that, you know, it was 100% a BPA pick. And like, I completely buy that where they're coming from with that. I don't think that was just blowing smoke out. I think he was so high on their board that they were like, we have to, even though we've already invested so much. But, you know, that was the drafting of Tylan Wallace. I've seen some kind of compare him to being redundant to Duvernay, or kind of having like he's a slot receiver and Duvernay's a slot receiver. So where does Wallace fit? So, you know, I don't really necessarily agree with that assessment based on watching, but, you know, watching both of them, I should say. And so, you know, how do you see Duvernay and Wallace fitting together in the 2021 offense?
Well, Wallace exclusively worked. I think he had 98% of his snaps were actually at right wide receiver. I think about 1.5% was at left wide receiver, and another one was right slot receiver. So he worked exclusively on the boundary. At the Senior Bowl, he got used in more slot alignments. So it was nice to see him in some tighter splits and in some, you know, slot alignments, able to separate over the middle of the field, you know, have consistent hands over the middle of the field, and all of that good stuff. Wallace was a, you know, first round buzz freshman sophomore player, has an ACL injury. So, you know, coincidentally, his twin brother has actually had 3 ACL injuries, which is a little strange. But Matt Waldman, who does the rookie scouting portfolio, he has a really interesting point. Wallace basically tore his ACL in 2019, came back, and the first moment he was fully rehabbed was halfway through Oklahoma's summer program, through their camp. So Matt Waldman believes, you know, he has explosiveness still that he is going to gain back. I don't think that's going to be an unrealistic thing, but we have seen him without that explosiveness. And what you get is a really, really, really incredible late hands contested catch receiver on 9 routes, on deep routes, working the sideline. He has great body control. He makes fantastic late adjustments. He's about 5'11", 190, I believe he was at his pro day. You think he's 6'1", 210. He plays, you know, not, you know, I'm not going to, people throw Steve Smith around, and I don't mean to throw that around, but just the first thing that comes to mind. He plays way bigger than he is. Yeah. He is going to go up and get the ball. He's going to dunk on guys. Can you do, you know, you don't want that to be the trump card, a guy who can't separate and just, you know, Laquan Treadwell has become the famous fable now, I guess is the best way to put it, or the famous example. But that's not all he can do. But he kind of reminds me, and this is the extreme example, but Adam Thielen has become so good at flashing his hands so late in routes at the very, very, very end of the catch point. That's when his hands come out. And that's how Tylan Wallace won a lot of the time at Oklahoma State. I think that people might see similarities because Duvernay and Wallace are both kind of bamfs after the catch. Duvernay is like a running back. Wallace has some moments where he's running, shoulder pad to shoulder pad, getting low and running right through a defender. But to me, Duvernay is a much more linear athlete that has incredible speed. And, he has a decent catch radius, but not really a contested catch forte kind of guy, more so a manufactured touch and working over the middle of the field guy. Whereas Wallace, at the Senior Bowl, he was impressive. He wasn't really wowing you like a Kadarius Toney with his ability to create separation, but just subtle push-offs, clean movement, very efficient. He doesn't do too much. I think he's just going to be a very high caliber professional wide receiver 3, wide receiver 4. And, maybe at some point he can get into that wide receiver 2 sort of mold, but that would be kind of his ceiling in my opinion. And I would think that a role kind of similar to maybe Seth Roberts from a couple of years ago over the next 2 years, a guy who gets maybe 20, 30 targets, and you can see what he can do there. He's just very calm. He finds the markers. He knows how to separate using push-offs and using his hands and flashing late hands. So Wallace to me is kind of similar to a Seth Roberts with a little more pizzazz, if you will. And Roberts, I think is someone who's a little underrated. He was a receiver who stuck around in the NFL for quite some time. So you got to give credit and understand that's a professional wideout. And if that's the kind of role he can fill out of a 4th, 5th round guy who can go catch 20 passes for you in year 1 or year 2, you're pretty happy there, and ultimately providing depth. And I just love the doubling down from Eric DeCosta in general, because it ends up in situations like Hayden Hurst and Mark Andrews sometimes where one of them isn't quite panning out and the other one does, and it doesn't really matter what round they're in, but you're ensuring that, let's say, heaven forbid, Rashad Bateman struggles. You took another swing on a really talented guy, and you're making sure that you don't completely whiff in that positional room more so than if you just went with Bateman and didn't worry about receiver again.
Yeah, and the way I see Wallace is he, I think he's going to be able to play outside a little bit. Like I said in the previous conversation, like you can't really put these guys in a box because they just, not only do the Ravens move them around, but pretty much any guy and any team nowadays is moving between the slot and out wide. It's just kind of how the NFL is going these days. So, there are some strictly slot wide receivers, but it's not necessarily quite what it used to be in terms of like your slot wide receiver. So I see Wallace as more of like a true, wide receiver, whereas I see Duvernay as more of like a weapon. And, it's just a guy that you are going to scheme touches for, but he's also the guy that can go out and get you some slam dunks and splash some big plays for you. And happy to see someone develop and, address a skill set gap. Like it can happen in any offseason. And that's why it's so hard to make sweeping judgments that, this guy is what he is. And, I'm about to say that about Duvernay, but he could develop this offseason, and until you see it, you don't know it exists. But I just don't see the type of flexibility in his route running where I think he's going to develop a strong route tree in the NFL. And that's kind of the weird thing with Duvernay when everyone's like, why isn't he starting in the slot? He's getting 20 yards every time he touches the ball. And yes, he was making some plays, but I think that the one play, sorry to interrupt you, the one play that made people go crazy was that end around against the Bengals. And any receiver would have gotten 40 yards on that play. Yeah. But not to take away from Duvernay, but they did a good job manufacturing some touches for him. And I just see him as a very north-south player right now. Sometimes when he runs like an in-breaking route, he almost makes a full stop when he goes to make his break on his instep. And so that's a little bit of a concern.
He's a little stiff. And
that's
why I said I called him. My polite way of saying that was he's a linear athlete.
Yeah,
he is working on a vertical plane.
And I'll give a shout out right now to AC Slade at Big Play Receiver, because one of the things he mentioned to me going into the draft was, one of the gaps that we actually have on this team is, your traditional Z receiver depth, where, there isn't, like, if Marquise Brown goes down, it's like, who's that kind of speedy north-south player?
Duvernay did actually play a lot of snaps out wide last year.
He was 50-50. I think he was 146 out wide and 1 53 inside or something like that. So they saw him as like a slot Z guy, and that's kind of how I see him. Whereas I think Wallace can play outside. I think where Wallace is going to unlock his true potential is going to be as a slot wide receiver, and that's just because of the toughness and the depth chart at outside right now. Like, it's hard to project. We have Bateman developing as, you know, if he becomes what we think he's going to be, and we know what Brown can do. Yes, you know, like I said, Wallace and Brown will move around, and we're not going to box these guys in. But, you know, typically Brown's probably going to be your Z type guy, and that opens the door at slot for a competition. So, you know,
you want Marquise Brown in motion, and who comes in motion? The Z receiver, because he's off the line.
Exactly. And so, like, I don't know, like I want to bring it up because I've seen people kind of compare them, and I'm like, I don't really see, not only do I not really see a similar skill set, I think there's very specific differences that you highlighted quite well, but I just think their usage is going to be completely different as well. And, you know, that kind of walks us into one spot. I got to ask the question, do you see guys such as Deon Cain or Benjamin Victor actually having a shot at taking down that 6th wide receiver spot, or is it just going to be between Boykin and Prochet?
I'd like to say it's between Boykin and Prochet, but at the same time, I'm talking about this clean slate. And you mentioned Jalen Moore earlier, a guy who Marlon Humphrey, I think Wink Martindale, and pretty much everybody mentioned him after OTAs. And maybe it ends up being more of a Jeremy Butler situation, but I don't think anyone has the upper hand in that competition. Boykin, you know, is going to have to come in, play confidently, and assert, hey, I'm this physical, blocking, contested catch, able, which thing with Boykin is it might be nice if someone would lob him up some 50-50 balls, but it would also be nice if he was running the right route and knew where he was supposed to be, and you could trust him to be there and not just a cornerback. So that's the catch-22 there. But hey, get in the playbook, see what he can do. Prochet, they like his special teams ability. You know, Duvernay ended up kind of replacing him because of a roster crunch, but I'm sure they like him on other units aside from returner. I'm sure that they like him as a slot receiver. He shows the ability to separate over the middle of the field really well. He's very sudden. He had an outstanding, basically not dropping the ball track record at SMU. I think he had 2 drops and like 230 targets over the last couple of years there. So that doesn't surprise you. And then Deon Cain's a guy that the Steelers liked and just couldn't keep. So I just think it will be a pretty open competition. But out of all of those guys, it seems to me in a very biased way that Lamar kind of includes Prochet in his group of, you know, he mentioned they drafted Bateman, and he was like, all right, yeah, we got Watkins, we got Hollywood, we got Andrews, we got Prochet. You don't hear Boykin ever mention. Prochet gets invited to the bachelor party and the anniversaries and the birthday dinners, and I don't think Boykin does. So, you know, maybe you ask a little bit of Lamar's input there, but to me, Boykin is just the one guy to that group who can block better than anyone else. He's really good on special teams, and he came on strong, and I think he showed the ability to dig himself out of a hole, or I guess not dig, but climb out of a hole that he dug himself and score some touchdowns late in the year, you know, make some key blocks throughout the year. And he was in a really bad place at one point. Really, I have never seen a receivers coach, offensive coordinator, and quarterback kind of unanimously blame a receiver for running the wrong route and for the receiver to just take it. And he turned around from that. So that shows a lot of cojones to me, and a lot of, you know, that classic kind of cheesy catchphrase, you know, think about the next play, think about the next game, you know, have a short-term memory, or be able to get rid of it. Whatever they say about quarterbacks, live play to play, or forget about the last play, whatever. Boykin showed the ability to move past his mistakes. He seems like a hard worker. He seems quiet and humble and all of those good things. And to me, you know, Prochet, you've now got Andrews, who works in the slot, Hollywood Brown, who led the NFL in slot touchdowns in 2019. Sammy Watkins works out of the slot. Rashad Bateman works out of the slot. Devin Duvernay works out of the slot, and they like him over Prochet, at least last year, and he played relatively well there. So now you're talking about the 6th slot option. That is not very enticing in terms of, you know, guys I want on the 53-man. You have Devin Duvernay to return. He looked at better as a punt returner than Prochet did, in my opinion, last year once he took over. And then Boykin, you know, the tallest, the biggest combine freak of all of them, and can block. He can also, I mean, they like him as the punt what is it called? The evil on punt when you're trying to go block a punt. They like him for those kinds of things. They like him on kickoff. They like him to tackle, maybe be a gunner and things like that. So that provides a little different ability than Prochet being like the second or third best returner and like the fifth or sixth slot option. So it's tough between them, but ultimately I do feel that you do want to ask Lamar's input in a way and say which of these guys, is on the right page with you. And it seems like it might be Prochet.
Yeah, and I think that's a perfect summary because it really comes down to, I think it's a pretty easy argument that Boykin is probably the better scheme fit vis-a-vis roster flexibility and just positionality, because they do have so many guys that can play out of the slot. They don't have as many guys that are true outside guys. Like who's kind of the, if Watkins is hurt and then Bateman's kind of struggling, so you want to get him out of the slot, it's like who's playing the X now? So, I think that gives Boykin a huge bump up. And Prochet losing a little bit of his return man, like he was a super solid return man, don't get me wrong. Like it was at the point where he'd get out there and I was like, he's going to catch the ball. I can sleep easy.
He's going to catch the ball. I might go get 15, 10 yards. Yeah. And
but Duvernay brings that
electricity.
He can splash one. He's a north-south out. He's a linear athlete, and that's what you're looking to get these guys to do. And he just has that kind of feel for making guys miss. He's
great in the open field. He's a running back. He's squatty like one. He's explosive. He can run through contact. Something we didn't get to see him do as a receiver much on his, 20 catches? I can't remember how many he had, 20, 22 maybe. But something I think that's what we'll see a leap from Duvernay is after contact, yak, rack, whatever you want to call it. That's something I could see happening. And to me, Prochet just didn't show that same physical prowess.
100%. And so if now he's lost a little bit of his shine as a return man, it's like he's probably not really the speed guy that's going to develop as like a gunner. Whereas, say Boykin, like we're talking about this fresh slate, maybe Boykin's like, all right, listen, I'm a depth wide receiver. I'm not going to be a starter. I need to kind of reinvent my game. We see this in sports all the time. That's the beauty about all these podcasts that are popping out. We're getting these guys on podcasts. We can hear them actually talk about reinventing themselves. Maybe Boykin becomes like, I'm going to be, I'm a depth wide receiver. I'll get in there. I'll make plays when I'm in there. Like we've seen him do, like we saw him do at the end of the year with some of those.
The pressure's not on Boykin anymore. You brought in Watkins. You brought in Bateman. Maybe you're not relying on him to be there every play, playing 55% of snaps, being a key guy. So the pressure's off. He can pick his spots maybe and feel more confident.
And maybe he's like, I'm going to develop as a special teams gunner. I mean, he's got all of the
Chris Moore signed the Texans.
Yeah. So like, I really see that sixth spot as being Boykin's to lose, but you can't discount your point. And it is something he has kind of seemed like the kind of outcast in the room. Like
black sheep.
When they go down and have, lunch at the cafeteria, Boykin's sitting with, the stinky offensive lineman guys,
He's Steven Glansberg eating pudding by himself.
No, exactly. And so, it has to factor in. So it's going to be interesting. It's the beauty of this competition. We're looking at, all right, we have a 3rd round pick versus a 5th round pick for our 6th spot rather than the Antoine Wesley versus Jaleel Scott days or the Jeremy Butler rises.
Gordon Lasley.
I'm just so sick of it. And it's just, the beauty of what EDC has done. Like, I think he's brought in so much talent, so much diversity in the skill sets of the guys that are here. I think it's just, you can sense it. And that's kind of the sense that I'm getting from some of the guys that are at camp or were at OTAs. Like, they can see it. They see Williams and Martin way more active on the field than any receivers coach prior to this year. Like, they're out there, focusing on very key things. There's a lot more activity going on that maybe the wide receivers hadn't seen in the past 3 or 4 years. So I think it's going to be a huge difference with this wide receiver group.
Yeah, and what Daniel Jeremiah and Bucky Brooks like to say on Move the Sticks podcast, and something that I used to learn a lot from them when I was starting to really take myself a little bit too seriously, but kidding. But when I was trying to learn a little more and some of these professional sort of euphemisms, and what they say is you want your receiver room to be like an NBA starting 5. You want a point, a 2, a 3, a 4, a 5. And right now you're looking at Marquise Brown as the point guard. You've got Rashad Bateman looking like a high scoring 2. Sammy Watkins, that versatile kind of 3-4 bigger guy. And, you can throw in, I guess, Devin Duvernay as a 3 or whatever you want. And then you got Miles Boykin as that center. And he's the only one that fits that real huge wingspan, tall, physical profile. can he get the playbook right? And that's what I think, Keith Williams and T. Martin could really help him with. You have a Greek god, basically, that runs a 4.4, jumps 40 inches, has an unbelievable agility, blocks his tail off. He hustles on special teams, but he was struggling with his confidence in the playbook a little bit. So, that's fun as a coach, having, an Adonis that just needs a little refinement. And that's the kind of player that has success, and you feel amazing as a coach. You're giving yourself pats on the back, high-fiving each other like, yes, this shouldn't have been hard for anybody else. We were able to get this guy's head on his shoulders and get him going. And at the end of the day, he blocks his tail off. I mean, he is a dominant, one of the best in the NFL, dominant point of attack perimeter blocker. He crumbles defensive backs. He will pin corners into the end zone, into the pylon. How many times have we seen that happen? So when you've got a guy that does all of those things, like you said, Cole, he doesn't have to be the number 2 or the number 3. He can take a step back. And if he wants to look at special teams a little more, wants to look at his blocking a little more, and really, look at Nick Boyle. Nick Boyle is not a top 25 receiving tight end, but he's one of the best tight ends in the league because he does what he does well and focuses on it to the max. And
we are a Nick Boyle friendly podcast.
Oh, yes. Oh, yes. The sixth tackle, baby.
Oh,
the sixth lineman.
Just an incredible guy. And I seriously almost drove down to Maryland and started getting in some fights when people were talking about cutting him this year. That ain't flying in my Twitter streets, that's for sure. But thank you so much, Spencer. I think we've covered everything. Everyone's got a good sense of what these guys are coming into camp, what we're going to see, and thank God we have a preseason to actually watch these guys perform this year, because that was an element that it crushed me, especially with me focusing on offensive line. Sometimes I barely got to see Ben Bredesen play, and now I got to deal with people being like, well, he might not be any good, and it's like, maybe, I don't know. How do you know? How does anyone know? So now we're finally going to get to see.
That was what you and I were simpatico on Ben Powers last year. We were high on him, and then he came in and we were like, all right, he was all right. He was a little less than we expected, but we finally got to see, so we finally got to know. And exactly. That's what this preseason will help in the receiver room. I'm really excited to see what James Prochet can do on a heavy snap, heavy target basis in this preseason.
Even if it's against backups, it's still film. It's still film to digest and take, that's one thing. Obviously dominating lesser competition needs to be factored in, but watching someone's ability to run routes, manipulate defenders, it doesn't really matter the level of competition to take away some of those.
Well, they're fighting for a roster spot too.
And the level of competition is so high. Yes, these guys maybe, guys that end up on practice squads are not even in the NFL, but, they're still some of the best football players out there. So it's not like they're all just a bunch of pushovers. So, I can't wait to get going. Everyone out there, be sure to follow Spencer's work. You can find him. Published Scout with Sports Info Solutions. We'd love to see it. Baltimore Beatdown, including the Baltimore Beatdown podcast. Good friends with us. With the verified man himself, Jake Luke. We'd love to see that as well.
Love to see it.
Before you go, I got to ask, how many wide receivers and who gets the 6th spot? Your final prediction?
I think my prediction ultimately is Prochet. I'm going with my gut a little bit more than my head. Like I said, you do have that Adonis in Boykin to work with, but Prochet to me is just invited to the birthday parties, it looks like. I think Lamar likes him. I think that he fits the bill and is a competitive guy that probably would have done a little better with a little bit more opportunities last year than what Boykin proved to do. So to me, I think he just has a little bit more of a natural sync with this offense than Boykin does. But at the same time, I might be very wrong just because of what I said. Boykin blocks better than anyone else, and he is the Adonis of the group. He's a 99th percentile athlete, and he's incredible at blocking, being a hard worker, and things that you can't quite coach, but the coachable aspect is very much in question.
Bang on, and that's exactly why my prediction, I'm going with Boykin. If you guys are still here, drop a comment down below. Tell us what you think. What's the wide receiver going to look like? Thanks again so much, Spencer. Be sure to follow his work at Ravens for Dummies on Twitter. Be good to yourselves. Be good to each other.